Hello and welcome to the GPAT Neighborhood. I'm your host, Steve Rowe, and our guest today is Dr. Angelo Collins, Executive Director of the East Carolina University Center for STEM Education. Dr. Collins joined the center a little over a year ago. Welcome to the GPAT Neighborhood, Dr. Collins. The ECU Center for STEM Education is a relatively new name, but the operation of the center's predecessor goes back quite a while. Tell us a little history of the ECU's involvement in STEM education, and you also might describe what STEM education is.
Thank you, Steve. It's a real pleasure to be here. The current image of the center is about 3 years old, and part of the signal of this center was the change to the Center for STEM Education, and the name before that was very clunky. It was CMSTE or something like that. Mm-hmm. Centers were established here in North Carolina back in the 1980s, around 1985, and there were many of them, most of them university-based, mm-hmm. and there was a network funded by the state. Mm-hmm. And at that point, their primary purpose was to serve as a conduit between the university and the K-12 school system.
Mm-hmm. Was this part of the State Department of Education, or was it some other state?
No, it was out of the Department of Education.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Recently, the state defunded the entire network, and East Carolina took the opportunity at that point to change the mission, change the name, mm-hmm. and hire a new director, and that's how I got here. Mm-hmm. STEM is a really powerful political phrase right now, and it stands for S for science, T for technology, E for engineering, and M for mathematics. Mm-hmm. However, some people think it should be STEM squared with the M, with two M's, mm-hmm. one for mathematics and one for medicine.
Right.
Some people think it should be STEAM, mm-hmm. with an A stuck there in the middle standing for art, because art requires creative thinking and the other disciplines also require creative thinking. Most of us in education struggle with STEM being these four independent disciplines who reinforce one another and require the work of one another. For example, technology has to do with solving human problems, and then engineering builds the materials mm-hmm. to implement those solutions. There are others who think that STEM is becoming a brand new discipline, mm-hmm. complete and independent of and on its own.
Mm-hmm. We might think that a center like this is aimed at current ECU students, but that's really not the case. Who's your target audience for your STEM center programs?
A part of the revisioning of the center was creating a new vision, and I actually brought part of it with me so I wouldn't say it wrong. Mm-hmm. But one of the goals is establishing relationships with business, industry, K-16 educators, and community leaders, so that we're dealing with teachers, students, university people, business people, the general mm-hmm. public. Our goal is to reach the widest audience we possibly can.
Mm-hmm. Some older folks, maybe like you and me, could remember when America woke up to the importance of math and science education after the Russian Sputnik went up in 1957, and a few years later when President Kennedy challenged the nation to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, the 1960s. But there must have been some renewed interest somewhere to get us to start thinking about STEM education in more current times. What prompted this renewed interest?
I think there are 3 or 4 things that are really important. One is our increased reliance on technology in our daily lives, in business and in manufacturing. During the time of Sputnik, we mm-hmm. didn't all have cell phones, mm-hmm. and now students use computers. The going story is that there is more technology in the cell phone that I brought with me today than there was in the entire structure of the Sputnik mm-hmm. Satellite. So there's an increased role of science and technology in our society today. A second is the increased emphasis on international comparisons mm-hmm. about performance of students. And TIMSS, the Third International Math and Science Study, which is now Trends in Math and Science mm-hmm. Study, and PISA, which all measure international student performance, show that U.S. students don't particularly score well. But along with this is the increased measuring of what students do, and the technological ability to do precise measures and do these kinds of comparisons. I'm an academic, and so I have to think that there is another reason. As you said, we've both been around for a little while. Society, by what it chooses to fund and support, decides what knowledge is most worth. So when I was a kid, I now know that the primary curriculum theory, the primary rule that was used to decide what knowledge is of most worth, were the problems, interests, and needs of students. So I studied refrigerators and sewing machines in my high school science class. After the Second World War, there was a major shift that it was more important that students understand the very nature of the discipline. What makes science science? And I think from my academic point of view that there is a shift again in what knowledge is of most worth. And this shift is to career and college readiness and workforce development. And because the STEM disciplines are so important in workforce, this seems to bring the emphasis that we've got right now.
After Sputnik and after the moon landing in '69, there was a great emphasis, certainly in the elementary, well, middle and high school levels anyway, on science and math.
Yeah.
Did it then decline, and did something else replace it, or was there just this outburst of all kinds of educational things you could study, and it kind of took a second seat to other things? And if so, what were those other things? I guess we'd be looking at maybe the 70s and 80s by now. Yeah, and I can't imagine that science was ever de-emphasized, but there must have been something that maybe moved to the forefront in our educational system.
You know, that's a tough question, and I wish I could come up with an answer for it. Again, because I've been around for a long time, even though we have new standards for science and new standards for engineering and new standards for mathematics, they don't seem to be a whole lot different from the ones that were back there in the 60s. But they're hard to implement.
Yeah.
They're very, very difficult to implement, and they're expensive.
Science, technology, engineering, math requires equipment.
They require equipment, they require time. I know if my colleagues who taught English were here, they'd say, well, we have to grade all our essays, so that takes a whole lot of time. And my colleagues who are art teachers would say, well, we have to teach the students the basics and give them enough time to set up their materials. One of the fascinating things about living in a democracy is that all kinds of people get to contribute what they want to say about what knowledge is of most worth. And so there's a constant tug here in the United States about what's going to have primacy and how it's going to balance out. We're not static. I know some of our listeners will have heard that Finland scored incredibly high on the recent international exam called PISA. But it's important to remember that Finland is the size of the state of Wisconsin.
Right.
So there's more students in New York City than there are in all of Finland. And we have a decentralized education system in the United States, and states claim states' rights in their education.
Let's talk specifically about the ECU Center. What sorts of programs does the ECU Center sponsor or coordinate? Give us some examples, and could you quantify how popular they've been in the last 2 or 3 years? How many folks participate?
Well, because of the defunding of the network, and because of my being new, and because of changing in funding and changing in focus, we have a few programs that I call our solid programs. Summer Ventures in Science and Mathematics is still a state-funded program where students, rising juniors and seniors in high school, have an opportunity to spend 4 weeks on campus taking courses they couldn't take in high school and engaging in research.
Now, is this it's a statewide program, but is it only at the smaller number of centers, or is it available at lots of universities?
There are only 4 universities here in North Carolina that run Summer Ventures programs, and part of the funding formula is at ECU, we don't support students from the eastern part of the state. So we have students from around the state.
Oh, really? Okay.
And students from the eastern part of the state may be going to App State or Raleigh or Charlotte. And because it's state funded, there's an allocation, so there are always some students from every district in the state who participate. But this past year we had 130 students engaged in Summer Ventures, which was pretty exciting. Advanced Placement is one of our programs that we're really proud of. Advanced Placement is a program for high school teachers who are going to teach their kids the advanced placement courses.
Right.
And we had 50 some advanced placement teachers with us this summer, completing a course of study to make them better teachers. And last April and again this April, we will invite those teachers and their students to come for a review day to help the students get better prepared for their advanced placement course. And what's cool about that is the students work with some teacher who isn't their regular classroom teacher, so they have a lot of fun doing that. Science Olympiad is a big program here in Eastern North Carolina, and just in the last month we've taken over running Science Olympiad here in Eastern North Carolina. Last year we had over 300 students on campus involved in Science Olympiad. Students come in teams and compete in science and technology related activities. STEM Girls is a program for middle school girls where they spend a day on campus. STEM Day is a program for high school students where they spend a day on campus.
And all these programs, now that's 5 right now, you make available to whoever can come, and you advertise them to all your school districts. Do you focus mainly on the eastern third of the state, or do you make it statewide?
I'm actually pushing down to one of your questions. There are 4 remaining centers, and Monday and Tuesday of this week, the center directors met and talked about how we support one another and don't overlap. So we are located, we focus our efforts primarily east of I-95. But before we move on, I want to talk about our biggest program, and it isn't actually a program. We have a materials lending library. There are more than 5,000 items in the lending library, and we are eager to lend these materials to teachers in public schools, in private schools. This summer we lent materials to some of the camps related to, associated with some of the churches who run church camps during the summer so they can do STEM activities. It's our fault that the lending library isn't more well known, and we're working right now to make people know that we've got everything from test tubes to telescopes, from number lines to counting tiles to calculators and GPS systems that we would be very happy to have teachers borrow and use in their instruction. So thanks for letting me put in my commercial.
Good, yes. Do STEM education programs extend down into the elementary schools? Is technology and engineering being taught in the elementary schools these days?
Definitely. My colleague Tammy Lee in the college runs a summer camp. Well, let me try that differently. My colleague Tammy Lee with her colleague Mark Sprague have a grant from the state called the Math Science Partnership, and they call their grant Physics is Essential. And this year they will be working with teachers in grades K through 3 to help them understand physics and design instructions with physics ideas and activities that are appropriate for that grade level. The year before, they did grades 3, 4, 5. I'm making these up, but that's about right. And the year before that, 5, 6, 7. So that they've been working in elementary schools. And while that program is not officially part of the center, we support it with some of our staff, and I'm pleased to serve on their advisory board.
Where does this Center for STEM Education fit in the ECU structure, apart from working with all kinds of teachers in school and school districts? Where do you fit in the ECU structure?
Right now, the center is administratively in the Department of Mathematics, Science, and Instructional Technology, which is a department in the College of Education. But I have close working relationships both with the College of Arts and Sciences and with the College of Technology and Computer Science. So that the 3 of us work really well together. And I've actually spent a little bit of time out at the med school to see if there are ways that their programs to improve medical education and attract people to medical careers could be done. We could do some things to work together.
You're watching the GPAT Neighborhood, and our guest today is Dr. Angelo Collins, Director of the ECU Center for STEM Education. Dr. Collins, how did you get interested in and involved in STEM education? Tell us a little about your own background.
I think I got interested in STEM education because back when I went to school, I was told that girls weren't supposed to do science.
And you didn't want to hear that.
And I did not want to hear that. I remember very clearly that in high school there were only 7 girls in 3 sections of physics.
Wow.
And we sort of supported one another. And I was fortunate to become a teacher during one of these revolutions in curriculum. When I was a senior in college, I had an assistantship, and what I did was collect mulberry leaves to feed to silkworms for a professor who was doing cancer research using silkworms. And I started teaching, and I kept thinking, what I'm teaching isn't what I love about doing science, the curiosity, the excitement. And that was the same time where the curriculum revolution, the post-Sputnik revolution was happening. And I was fortunate to teach in schools where people said, go ahead and try it.
Were you a math and science whiz in high school and college, or was it just a kind of a passion and interest?
I was a first-class nerd.
Really?
I'm not sure I was a whiz, but I clearly was a nerd.
How'd you happen to come to ECU? Where were you before you came to ECU?
I've had a really full career, and my friend Charlie Coble, who was dean at ECU and with whom I have worked on some national project, wrote and said, this looks like a job that's just perfect for you. Why don't you apply? And here I am.
Yeah. Where were you before ECU?
I was the founding executive director of the Knowles Science Teaching Foundation, which is a not-for-profit that supports high school science and math teachers across the country.
Part of the purpose of STEM education efforts in middle schools, high school, and college is to encourage interest in and maybe even mastery of some pretty technical and complicated subjects. But why is that? Do we just want people better educated, or is there also maybe not an ulterior motive, but maybe a career idea somewhere in the background too, that kids who are better educated in science and technology might be able to find good jobs?
My entire career, I've been trying to struggle with, why should kids study science? Why should kids study STEM? Why should kids study mathematics? And the answer is a nerdy academic answer. But when I think of science as having 3 components. One is the idea part, or technology or education or math, the idea, the concepts, the facts, the laws. But the second part is understanding how these ideas came to be. Curiosity, attention to detail, how to structure an argument based on evidence, how to know the difference between evidence and inference, how to communicate clearly, and then the last one is application. But it's the second one that I think is the biggest value in learning science. And I think this is what our business community is calling for. Our business community seems to be asking more for students who can think on their feet, can solve problems, can use their ideas. And with the technology that we've got, I mean, almost any idea that you want to find, you can zip up on your cell phone. And so memorizing esoteric formulas seems to be less important now than it was 25 years ago. And finding those ideas and using them to solve problems and construct arguments in the scientific sense of the world, not disagreements, but I believe this particular model is going to solve this problem, and these are the reasons why I use that.
In your time in Greenville so far, have you become exposed to local employers who wish the students, the future employees, were better educated in STEM topics?
Oh, definitely.
Really?
Definitely. I've had opportunity to spend some time with Phil Hodges at Metric, who has been very helpful, and John Chafee and Wanda Uhaus have both worked with me in some of the economic development activities, so that I've been able to participate in some of their meetings. And this is what they are calling for, is students who have enough skill to do the jobs. So they don't particularly care if the kids can memorize the Krebs cycle. They want to know if they can problem solve an event in their business on their feet right now. And I'm not saying that none of the other disciplines can do that. I'm just a little biased that I think the STEM disciplines are particularly fertile ground for doing
the whole
that.
idea of problem solving and thinking on your feet would seem to me to be obvious a component of learning about science, technology, engineering, and math, as opposed to, and I'm a liberal arts guy, as opposed to being able to write a pretty sentence. But you've got to have a combination of all that, I'm sure. Have you received any feedback yet from, in your time here, from school administrators or even from parents about the success of the opportunities that are available through the ECU Center? Is it still a little early in your tenure?
I think it's a little early. I need to speak highly of my colleagues that I've met and worked with at the Pitt County schools, including Connie Chesson and Karen Quick and Tim DeCreasy. Earlier I listed some of our big programs. One of the things that surprised me, when I came and interviewed for the job, I left thinking there wasn't much going on. But now that I've been here a year and spent a lot of time talking to people, there are so many programs going on here in Eastern North Carolina that the opportunities are just almost beyond measure. And one of the things that I would hope the center would become very good at would become the clearinghouse, so that people would know that there are several different robotics events coming on this fall. That in addition to the Science and Engineering Fair, there's the Academic Science Fair, and there are 3 math competitions that are going on. So besides what's going on in schools, and besides what's going on in some of the nonprofit, there are things happening by groups of interested parents, by the Boys and Girls Clubs. There's just so much going on.
You wouldn't think just superficially that this would be an area of high tech, high science, that sort of thing. So when you came here, it sounds like you were kind of pleasantly surprised to see what the school systems were doing and what maybe some of the companies were doing and that sort of thing.
Well, like everybody new at a job, I sort of had a honeymoon semester. And during my honeymoon semester, I tried to interview as many people as I possibly could. And every time I met one person, they suggested 2 or 3 more, and I found all these exciting pockets. And I would love, in fact, I plan, hopefully before this semester is over at the university, to bring some of these groups together and just have them tell one another what they're doing and possibly using the center's website to advertise their work. We don't want to take it over, but we really think it would be important. We're really excited that there's a group of people interested in robotics who's been meeting informally in the last couple of weeks. Simple things to make sure that robotics competitions by different groups aren't being held on the same day.
Right. Now, in addition to the ECU Center, the Greenville area also has an outdoor science center that John and Nancy Bray run. That's called a Time for Science, Nature, and Science Learning Center, big name. And then ground was broken in May for a permanent home for the Go Science Center that Roger Connor is operating. Have you worked with either of these programs, these private operations in the past, and how do they fit in with what you want to do at the STEM Center, Center for STEM Education?
Okay. I've actually been out to a Time for Science and had a wonderful tour, thanks to John and Nancy. And I see them because our interests overlap at nerdy STEM-related social events, and we advertise everything that they send us about what's going on out there. We advertise physically at the center. It's not on the website yet, but maybe within a week. And I want to thank Roger because I actually sit on the board of directors for Go Science, and Roger and I constantly have conversations about how we leverage the work that each of our 2 groups are doing. Roger's office is actually in my building, so when they move to their new site, Roger's going to go away.
Right.
But in addition to these biggies that we already know about, Dr. Dufferin has done some work with us and doing some work with the Boys and Girls Clubs.
Right. Well, and there's Pitt County Schools has a health Health Science Academy.
Health Sciences Academy.
Health Sciences Academy.
And we have had conversations about a STEM Academy.
Oh, okay. Now we don't have, though, a high school yet that's math and science.
We do not have a STEM high school yet.
And a lot of communities do. Would that be helpful to the ECU Center? Would you see maybe some competition developing or not?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. North Carolina is one of the few states that has a rubric put out by DPI that says if you want to call yourself a STEM center, a STEM high school, these are the things that you need to actually do.
What sorts of, looking into 2014, what sorts of programs do you see yourself working with the Go Science Center and the Time for Science, if any? Maybe it's too early to think
At this point, I don't know. Go Science right now is very involved in getting the new building
Right,
done, and we actually at the last board meeting had a brief conversation about they've got the building, what are we going to do with it?
Right, right.
And while there are exhibits that exist that will go in, we've got to talk a lot about what kinds of programs are going to happen there.
Do you take your efforts out into the eastern third of the state, or do you kind of rely on folks to come to you, in places here in Greenville, say? Do you find yourself going to Elizabeth City or to?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. We have done some work with Beaufort County and with Craven County, and one of the goals for this year is to get out more.
How many of you are there?
That's a really difficult question to answer. There is me. I am
Okay.
the executive director.
Right.
The center has a full-time administrative assistant,
Okay.
and exactly a month ago, I hired an assistant director.
Okay.
During the
But you
last year, we bought out a little bit of time of some of the ECU faculty
was
in
saying-
arts and sciences,
If you're lucky, you can rely on several folks in
several
arts
bits and pieces
sciences
and people,
yeah.
and we spent most of our time writing grants because
Okay.
one of the things that the center needs going forward is a steady income stream. So we wrote 6 or 7 major grants last year.
Have any come in yet?
No,
Okay.
but we're still hoping.
Still hoping.
We're still hoping. And then we have a number of undergraduate students who put in hourly time who help us with
Okay.
things like making name tags for events and
Well,
entering
it seemed
data
to me
into
that
our
with
database.
ECU's focus on community outreach, that it would seem to me this would be a great opportunity for
Yes.
science, technology, engineering, and math students at ECU to do some community outreach as well.
Definitely. So we have a lot of students working on STEM Day and high school STEM Day and STEM Girls Day. We have students helping with the Science and Engineering Fair. Although the center doesn't run that, we do some supporting on that. So we've got a lot of students involved.
I meant to ask you when we were talking about some of the high school programs, science fairs. Do high schools still do science fairs?
High schools still do science fairs, although the people who run the Science and Engineering Fair are disappointed that the participation rate is as
Really?
low as it is. And I don't fully understand that these 130 high school kids who came to Summer Ventures this summer all did research. Every one of their projects would be a starting point for a science fair project. I will tell you that one of the state winners in last year's Science and Engineering Fair was a young woman from Eastern North Carolina.
Really? Okay.
And she was homeschooled, and her interest in science was supported through 4-H. So they're still out there, but
Yeah. Last question. Budget limitations aside, what sorts of programs would you like the Center for STEM Education to become involved in during the next couple of years that maybe you're not doing now? And based on what you know about STEM centers in other states or other communities.
well, I want to tell you that this week, Sunday and Monday, I was in St. Louis for a national gathering of university-based STEM center directors, and there were 52 of us there. And one of the tasks was generating what we all did, and we came up with this incredible list that then we tried to put some order on. And my assistant director went to a meeting on the same day of the STEM center directors here in North Carolina that are still functioning, and he and I haven't had a chance to sit down and talk, but he said, oh, they've got all kinds of ideas about what we're going to do. I've been trying to say to people that right now I see our center as being in the middle. So I don't see us involved at things at the state level like the North Carolina STEM Leadership Conference. And I'm not sure we're going to be a direct service provider, but I see us as providing a link between those two. If we could get half of the current STEM events on our website and hold regular meetings of the people who are involved in these events so they can talk to one another. If we could provide them support with stronger evaluation and research so they could leverage what they're doing. If I could get a couple of really good videos for kids to find out how to do the science fair project better than they're doing it, I think those would be really strong things to do. Once we got those done, then my next move would be to work with teachers. The Common Core in mathematics, in the decisions about how to organize high school mathematics here in North Carolina, and the essential standards in science, which may or may not be released by the national next generation science standards, are both going to put incredible burdens on teachers to redesign what they've been teaching, and to be public about it.
You've been watching the GPAT Neighborhood, and our guest today was Dr. Angelo Collins, who became Executive Director of the ECU Center for STEM Education in August 2012. I'm your host, Steve Rowe, and until next time, goodbye.